The invitation had described it as a networking reception, with formal attire encouraged, which Edrin Voss had learned, upon arrival, was the trade summit's way of saying masked ball without admitting to the particular kind of professional vulnerability that implied. Masks at a trade summit were, when you thought about it, a remarkably honest acknowledgement that commerce was easier without rank in the room, that the deals which got made in the margins of events like this happened because someone had managed, briefly, to forget who they were talking to and simply talked. The masks made the forgetting official. His was a serviceable human-made piece, dark material with copper detailing, the kind of thing a first-time summit attendee could procure from the vendor stalls near the entrance without spending money that should have been reserved for actual business. He had examined it in the ballroom's reflective paneling and concluded that it conveyed competent anonymity, which was all he needed. He was not here to be impressive. He was here to introduce Voss Transit Solutions, 2 cargo routes, 1 aging freighter, and a reliability record he was quietly proud of, to a room full of beings who would not have taken his registration call if he had been fully visible. The ballroom was a vast thing, which the station architects had achieved through the aggressive use of mirrored surfaces and strategic lighting that made the actual space feel 3 times its measured dimensions. Several hundred beings moved through it in the elaborate shuffle of formal dancing, combined with the subtler shuffle of professional positioning, finding the right partners, sustaining the right conversations, performing enjoyment while conducting work. Edrin had attended enough human networking events to recognize the choreography even across species. He danced with a Pelthian shipping representative first, discussed transit corridor pricing for 11 minutes, exchanged credentials, moved on. He danced with a Cashion from the manufacturing sector, covered commodity flow projections, the conversation pleasant and going nowhere. He danced with 3 others in sequence, accumulating the kind of interactions that might produce follow-up messages and might not, the typical yield of events like this. Then the 7th partner arrived. She came from his left, which placed her in the space the previous partner had vacated with a timing that suggested either coincidence or attention, and she was tall for the species he was tentatively categorizing her as. With a mask that was considerably more elaborate than the room's average, layered materials, structural elements, the kind of piece that had been made for a specific face rather than assembled from a vendor stall. She moved with the ease of someone who had danced many times in many rooms. "You've been working the floor methodically," she said, as an opening instead of a greeting. He had been. "Is it obvious?" "Only to someone doing the same thing," she said. "Though I started at the south end and you started at the north, so we were always going to meet in the middle." "Convergence," he said. "That's either good planning or fate, depending on your market philosophy." "I tend toward planning," she said, "but I leave room for useful accidents." They began to move with the music, which the station systems had calibrated to a tempo suitable for the room's species diversity, not fast enough to be demanding, not slow enough to be ceremonial. She was an easy partner, which he noted without examining too closely, because easy partners were either practiced or attentive, and both were data points worth having. "What sector?" she asked. "Cargo transit. 2 routes, 1 ship working on the 3rd route." He said it without apology, because apologizing for scale was a habit that made you smaller than you were, and he had broken it years ago. "You." "Policy adjacent," she said. He waited for more. She offered none, which told him something. "Policy adjacent covers a significant amount of territory," he said. "Most of the interesting territory," she agreed, "is in the margins of things." "What do you know about the Varanthi corridor situation?" It was not the question he had expected from someone describing herself as policy adjacent. The Varanthi corridor was a mid-rim transit issue that affected small operators disproportionately, a regulatory bottleneck that the large shipping conglomerates had the political infrastructure to navigate, and that independents like Edrin absorbed as cost. The fact that she knew it existed placed her in a category of either affected party or informed observer, and her tone suggested the latter. "I know it costs me 12% on the eastern leg," he said. "I know the regulatory framework was written for operators 40 times my size. And I know that 3 years of formal commentary from small transit providers has produced exactly no movement. The commentary process has structural problems," she said, with the tone of someone who had read the commentary. "The submission format disadvantages smaller operators because the template was designed by people who assumed all respondents would have legal teams." He looked at her. "That's a specific observation." "I read things," she said. The music completed its first movement and transitioned, and they moved with it, and he found that he was no longer cataloging the conversation for professional utility but simply having it, which was not what these events were for and was, he had to admit, considerably more interesting than what these events were for. She returned to him an hour later, which he noticed because he had been noticing the room with the attention of someone who has learned that peripheral awareness pays better than direct focus, and her approach registered as the evening's first genuinely unexpected variable. He had assumed their conversation was complete, pleasant, substantive, filed. Her return reclassified it. "The Marathi representative," she said, taking the position beside him at the edge of the floor where he had been observing the room, "is about to make an approach to the Kashin manufacturing block that is going to fail." He looked. The Marathi representative was indeed moving across the floor with the body language of someone who had made a decision. "How do you know?" "The Kashin block lead has been signaling closed positioning for 40 minutes. The Marathi representative has been too focused on his own approach to read it." She watched with the calm attention of someone observing whether "He'll realize in approximately 3 minutes." Edrin watched. In 2.5 minutes the Marathi representative stopped, recalibrated, retreated. "You read rooms," he said. "Occupational habit," she said. "What's your occupation?" "I told you, policy adjacent." "You told me a category," he said, "not an occupation." She turned to look at him, and through the mask structure he could see the quality of the attention, the particular amusement of someone who found the distinction worth making. "Most people don't push past the category. Most people are trying to figure out if you're useful to them," he said. "I already know you're interesting. It's a different question." A pause that he chose not to fill. "Dance with me again," she said. They returned to the floor. The second conversation moved through 3 different topics with the fluid ease of 2 people whose thinking complemented rather than competed, which was, in Edrin's experience, rare enough to be worth noting. She knew the small transit sector's regulatory landscape with a granularity that kept surprising him. Not the broad strokes that any informed observer might have, but the specific mechanical failures, the points where good policy intention had produced bad operational outcome. He found himself arguing back, which he rarely did in professional contexts because arguing back required being willing to be wrong, and professional contexts punished being wrong. She argued back at him with equal ease, and twice she conceded a point with the straightforward delivery of someone who found being wrong useful rather than threatening. "You're not a merchant," he said, during a pause in the music. "I trade in things," she said, "just not cargo. Information, among other things. Policy." She smiled, he could see the shape of it at the mask's edge. "Among other things." The music resumed and they moved with it, and he thought, whoever she is tomorrow, in the sessions, with her name and her credentials visible, she is going to be someone I did not expect to meet at a trade summit masked ball, and that is already worth the entrance fee. The environmental fluctuation was minor, a gravity calibration error in the station systems, the kind of thing that produced a brief compensatory shift before the automatic correction engaged. Most beings in the room adjusted without incident. His partner, whose mask had been engineered for standard gravity conditions and whose equilibrium was momentarily compromised by the correction's timing, took a half step that became a stumble, and her hand found his arm, and the mask shifted. It shifted by perhaps 3 centimeters. He was looking directly at her when it happened. 3 centimeters was sufficient. He knew the face. He knew it the way you knew faces that existed at the level of political infrastructure. Not personal knowledge, but the kind of recognizing that came from images in briefing materials, from news documentation, from the visual record of someone whose decisions were large enough to be publicly documented. The face of the Supreme Coordinator of the Varanthe Economic Federation was not a face you encountered in person as an independent operator of 2 cargo routes and 1 aging freighter. It was a face you saw in the context of policy announcements that affected your margins from a distance so vast that the causality barely registered as personal. Her hand steadied. The mask returned to position. The correction took perhaps 2 seconds. He continued dancing. This was not a decision he made consciously. His body made it, with the accumulated social intelligence of someone who had learned that the most dangerous thing you could do in the moment after an unexpected revelation was to react to it before you understood it. He held her hand at the correct position. He maintained the correct posture. He moved with the music. She was looking at him. He could feel her looking at him through the mask, with the quality of attention that was no longer the engaged attention of conversation, but the specific attention of someone who had just watched another person see something and was waiting to learn what they would do with it. He said nothing. She said nothing. The music continued. He thought about the Varanthe corridor and 12% on the eastern leg, and a submission format designed by people who assumed all respondents had legal teams, and someone who had read the commentary with sufficient attention to identify the template's structural problems. He thought about a room full of the most influential beings in the Economic Federation, and a supreme coordinator who had returned to a human merchant 3 times when she could have spent the evening with anyone. He thought about arguments conceded with straightforward delivery and information offered, without asking what it was worth. He thought about the mask, which was still in place, which she had not removed, which she had not needed to remove because she had clearly not intended for the evening to go the way it had gone, and which she had also not retreated behind. She was still here, still present, still holding his hand in the correct position for the dance. The Varanthe corridor situation, he said, because the silence needed something in it and this was what was true, is worse than the commentary record suggests. The 12% figure is my average. In a bad quarter, it's closer to 20. A pause. I know, she said. I didn't know, he said carefully, that someone at the level of policy had that granular a picture. Policy without granularity, she said, with a deliberateness that acknowledged everything, produces the template problems. Yes, he said, it does. They danced. The music had moved through 2 more compositions before either of them acknowledged the shape of what the evening had become. The ballroom was thinning, beings departing for private meetings, for rest, for the next day's official sessions where names and titles would be fully visible and conversations would be conducted in the careful register that rank required. She had not left. He had not left. They were at the floor's edge now, no longer dancing, standing in the particular proximity of 2 people who have run out of reasons to maintain distance and have not yet found a reason to close it. Her mask was fully in place. His had developed a slight tilt sometime in the 3rd hour that he had not corrected because correcting it would have required thinking about it. Tomorrow, he said, there are sessions. Yes, with credentials visible. Yes, the dynamic, he said, will be different. It will be what it is, she said. What it was tonight was also what it was. He looked at the floor, the remaining dancers, the mirrored surfaces that had been making the space feel larger than it was all evening. I want to ask you something. Ask. The room was full of beings whose operations run in scales that I genuinely cannot conceptualize, he said. Beings whose decisions you have actual shared vocabulary with, whose concerns map to yours in ways that mine don't, whose presence here represents actual strategic value. He kept his voice level because level was what the question required. You came back 3 times. She was quiet for a moment. The beings whose operations run at those scales, she said, tell me what they believe I want to hear, because they have learned that what I want to hear correlates with what benefits them. They have learned it so well that many of them have stopped noticing they do it. She paused. You argued with me about Eastern Corridor margins. You told me the 12% figure was an average and the bad quarters were worse. You were not calculating what I wanted to hear. You were telling me what was true because truth was the appropriate material for the conversation. He said nothing. I have access, she said, to a very large amount of information. I have considerably less access to people who say true things because they're true rather than because truth is useful. A pause. The steps were the reason I came back. The conversation was the reason I stayed. Outside the ballroom's environmental envelope, the station's cycles continued their indifferent rotation. Tomorrow the sessions would begin. Her title would be visible, and his credentials would be visible, and the distance that rank produced would be the distance they operated across. Tonight the masks were still in place, and the distance was what it was, and a human merchant with 2 cargo routes and 1 aging freighter stood at the edge of a dance floor with the full and settled knowledge that someone who made decisions affecting trillions had spent her masked evening talking trade philosophy with him, because he had not known to perform for her. For what it's worth, he said, the conversation was the reason I stayed too. She looked at him. He could feel it through the mask, through the remaining space between them, with the full and unguarded quality of someone who had spent an evening being anonymous and was considering what to do with the last of it. Tomorrow, she said, there will be a morning session on transit corridor reform. Small operator testimony is technically permitted under the summit's open comment provision, but the registration process is sufficiently obscure that no small operators have registered. She paused. The registration closes at the 6th hour. It is currently the 4th. He looked at her. That is, he said, an interesting piece of information. I thought it might be, she said, with the edges of a smile visible beneath the mask's careful architecture. Useful. He registered for the session at the 5th hour and 40 minutes. He submitted testimony that covered 12% averages and bad quarter figures and submission templates designed by people who assumed legal teams. And he said it all in the careful specific language of someone who had spent an evening being told that truth was valuable material. The Supreme Coordinator presided over the session from the elevated coordination position, fully titled and fully visible, and she asked him 2 follow-up questions with the precise professional attention of someone who had done their reading. Nothing in her manner acknowledged the masked ball. Nothing in his did either. The session produced a working group on small operator testimony integration that would, over the following 18 months, produce actual regulatory movement. At the session's conclusion, as the room was clearing, he found a message in his summit communication channel from an address that resolved to a staff office several levels above anything he had expected to receive correspondence from. It said, "The conversation was worth continuing, if you're willing." He read it twice. He thought about masks designed for specific faces, and partners who returned 3 times, and truth as the appropriate material for a conversation. He sent a reply. It said, "I'll bring the actual